June 4, 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. A group of tired German prisoners walked into the American mess hall, expecting thin soup and maybe a slice of bread. But what they saw stopped them in silence. Plates filled with roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, warm rolls, and even apple pie. The smell of real food filled the air. Forks clattered. Eyes widened. One soldier whispered, "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" The American guard shook his head. "No," he said. "That's just your dinner." For men who once believed America was weak, this meal was the first shock, and it wouldn't be the last. What happened next would change how they saw their enemies, and freedom itself. Before we begin, if you love powerful, untold stories from history, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and watch till the end. This is not a story about war, it's a story about humanity, kindness, and the meal that shattered everything they believed. July 4, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The sun was high over the plains when the train carrying German prisoners of war came to a slow stop. The men inside were silent, tired, and thin. They had traveled for days from the battlefields of North Africa, through crowded transport ships, and across miles of dusty rail lines in the middle of America. When the doors opened, hot air rushed in. It smelled of grass, diesel, and freedom they no longer had. American guards shouted orders. Some prisoners expected anger or revenge. Instead, they saw calm faces and clean uniforms. Trucks waited to take them to the camp, rows of wooden barracks, tall fences, and guard towers. But even from the gates, the men noticed something strange. Everything looked new, painted, and organized. It didn't look like a place built for hate. After roll call, they were led to the mess hall. It was their first American meal. Most expected watery soup or dry bread. Many whispered that the Americans would starve them. But when they entered the large hall, they stopped. The smell of roasted meat filled the air. On long metal counters sat trays loaded with food. Real food. There was beef with brown gravy, mashed potatoes with butter, soft bread rolls, and green beans. There was even a slice of pie. One prisoner, Carl Fisher, later wrote in his journal, "We thought this was a mistake. Surely this was for the guards, not for us." A guard near the door smiled and said, "It's yours, eat up." But the men didn't move at first. For months they had survived on small rations, sometimes just a crust of bread and watery cabbage. They couldn't believe the food was meant for them. One man whispered, "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" The guard laughed. "That's just for tonight. But Michaud." The room filled with the sound of metal forks hitting trays, quiet at first, then louder. The smell of gravy mixed with the sweat and dust of travel. Some prisoners ate carefully, cutting the meat into tiny pieces to make it last. Others devoured everything within minutes. A few couldn't finish. Their stomachs were too small after months of hunger. That evening, the camp doctor noted in his report, several men became ill from overeating. Their bodies are not used to such portions. Within 2 days, 43 cases of nausea were recorded. But even in sickness, there was confusion. Why were their captors feeding them like this? To the Americans, it wasn't kindness, it was policy. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be fed the same rations as American soldiers. The US Army followed the rules strictly. But for the German soldiers, this was hard to understand. Their own army often gave prisoners little food, sometimes nothing. Here, the enemy offered meat and milk. Private Wilhelm Lang wrote home months later, "The Americans feed us better than our own officers ever did. It makes you wonder what kind of world we were fighting against." The camp kitchen worked like a small factory. More than 2,000 prisoners were served 3 times a day. Local farmers delivered meat and vegetables. Bread came from a nearby bakery. Each day, 60 pounds of flour were used for every 100 prisoners. That was enough to make nearly 200 loaves daily. At night, as the men lay in their bunks, they talked about the meal. Some were suspicious. Maybe the food was a trick. Maybe it was meant to make them weak. Others said nothing but stared at the ceiling, full for the first time in months. For the guards, the reaction was almost funny. You'd think they never saw potatoes before. one wrote in his letter home. But the truth was, many hadn't seen them in years. The war in Europe had drained everything: food, fuel, and hope. By morning, the shock had not faded. Some prisoners hid small pieces of bread in their pockets or under pillows. Old habits die hard. Hunger was something they still didn't trust. In that quiet camp on the Kansas plains, far from the battlefields they had once fought on, a strange kind of lesson had begun. It wasn't taught with words or weapons, but with food, the language of survival. For the Germans, it was the first real taste of a paradox they couldn't explain. The enemy that had defeated them was now feeding them better than their own homeland ever had. But this was only the beginning. The food was not just comfort. It was a message, written in calories and kindness, that would reshape what they believed about America and about war itself. The food that amazed the German prisoners at Camp Concordia did not come from luck or generosity. It came from rules, strict, written, and signed. After World War I, the world had promised that prisoners of war would never again be starved or beaten. The 1929 Geneva Convention made sure of that, and the United States followed it word for word. According to U.S. Army Regulation 633, 1. Every German prisoner had to receive the same meals as an American soldier guarding him. That meant meat, vegetables, milk, and dessert, every single day. It was not an act of mercy. It was the law. The War Department worked with hundreds of local farmers, mills, and dairies. One of these was the Ellsworth Milling Company in Kansas. Their contract said they must provide 60 pounds of flour every day for every 100 prisoners. That was enough to bake bread for everyone, plus extra for emergencies. The food orders were carefully tracked. If supplies ran short, trucks from nearby towns filled the gap within hours. The average German prisoner received around 3,200 calories per day, nearly the same as a U.S. Army private, back in Europe. German soldiers were often getting only 1,250 calories a day, barely enough to survive heavy labor. The difference was not just numbers, it was a message. America could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own. At first, the prisoners thought this was propaganda. They want us to think they are rich and generous, one man told his bunkmate, but the abundance did not stop after a week or a month. The food kept coming, in the same amount, every single day. Prison diaries show the same surprise again and again. Steak again. They must be testing us, wrote Sergeant Otto Kramer. We have more butter here than my family saw in 5 years, another wrote. The rules were so strict that when food quality dropped, even slightly, officers recorded complaints. In one report, a camp inspector wrote, meat portions were slightly underweight, correction ordered immediately. Every meal was part of a larger system that stretched across America. More than 425,000 German prisoners were kept in U.S. camps between 1942 and 1946. Feeding them all required a nationwide effort: trains, farms, kitchens, and thousands of workers. The American Red Cross also checked the camps to make sure standards were met. They measured the calories, tasted the food, and compared it to soldier rations. When they found the prisoners were actually eating better than the guards, they noted it, but did not stop it. The rules were the rules. For many Germans, this strict fairness was almost impossible to understand. Back home, they had been told that Americans were greedy capitalists who hated them, but here, the same enemy weighed portions to make sure no one went hungry. It created quiet confusion and respect. In one report, Lieutenant Harold Smith, a camp officer, wrote, "They are beginning to understand that discipline does not always mean cruelty." Still, not everyone accepted the food with joy. Some prisoners felt guilty eating so well while their families starved in Europe. Letters home were often filled with mixed emotions. "Mother, I cannot describe it," one man wrote. "They give us coffee with milk, meat with sauce, and fresh bread every morning. But I think of you eating potatoes with salt, and it hurts." For the guards, the generosity served another purpose: control. A well-fed man is calmer, easier to manage, and less likely to escape. Hunger breeds anger, full stomachs bring silence. The policy worked. Concordia saw almost no riots and very few escape attempts. The prisoners began to understand something deeper. The food was not just about feeding the body, it was about showing power without cruelty, strength without hate. Every bite of mashed potatoes, every slice of bread, every cup of milk carried an invisible message. This is how the free world fights a war. But for men who had spent years under Nazi discipline, living on tiny rations and endless fear, this new reality was overwhelming. Some would struggle to believe it was real. Others would become sick from eating too much, too fast. The next days would test not just their stomachs but their minds, as the abundance they once dreamed of began to turn into something else: confusion, guilt, and even pain. The first few weeks at Camp Concordia were the hardest for many of the German prisoners, not because of punishment, but because of the food. Their bodies and minds could not adjust to the sudden abundance. For men who had gone months on starvation rations, the sight of full plates was both a miracle and a burden. On the second night, the camp doctor, Captain Walter Branson, wrote in his report, "Several prisoners are suffering from stomach cramps and nausea. They are overeating. They do not yet trust that food will come again tomorrow." By the end of that week, 43 cases of illness were recorded. It was not poison or disease, just the shock of too much food, too quickly. Many prisoners had spent months in Africa or Italy, where meals were rare and small. A single slice of bread could mean the difference between living or fainting in the sun. Now in America, they were given trays so full that many thought they were meant to share. When they realized the food was all theirs, their instincts took over: eat as much as possible before it disappears. The mess hall became a strange theater of habit. Some men ate so fast that they choked. Others hid bread under their coats or wrapped meat in napkins. They could not believe the next meal would come. "We had lived too long in a world where food vanished overnight," one prisoner said later. The guards noticed. They began checking bunks after meals. Under pillows they found bits of bread, half-eaten apples, even pieces of pie wrapped in paper. The food spoiled quickly in the summer heat. The smell of rot filled some of the barracks. When the guards asked why, one German sergeant simply said, "Tomorrow, maybe it stops." It never stopped. 3 meals a day, every day, as steady as the sunrise. Slowly, some prisoners began to relax, but others never did. Hoarding became a quiet habit, almost a sickness of its own. Psychologists who later studied the camps called it the hunger memory. The men's bodies had food, but their minds were still starving. One report from the camp hospital read, "Several subjects continue to hide food despite steady supply. Condition appears psychological." At night, the smell of stew and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Some men lay awake, thinking of families back home in ruined cities, wondering if their wives or children were eating at all. For them, every full plate carried a weight of guilt. Prisoner diaries from 1944 show the same feeling repeated again and again. "We eat well, too well, but our mothers and wives may be starving. It feels wrong. Each bite reminds me of what my country lost." Even when the body recovered, the emotions didn't. A few prisoners refused to eat dessert, saying it was too much pleasure for a prisoner. Others gave away their portions to new arrivals, trying to ease the guilt by sharing. Camp officers tried to keep order. They explained that the food supply was guaranteed, written in law, inspected by the Red Cross, delivered on schedule. Nothing would be taken away. Still, the habit of saving bread in pockets continued for months. Captain Branson once found a small group of men digging under their barracks. He thought they were planning to escape, but when they opened the hole, it was full of food: 87 bread rolls, 14 apples, and 23 pieces of cooked meat. It wasn't an escape tunnel, it was a pantry built out of fear. When the commandant heard about it, he didn't punish them. He only said, "Next time, ask for extra. There will be enough." The word spread through the camp. Slowly, the hoarding began to fade. But the memory never left them. Even years later, after returning to Germany, many former prisoners said they still kept small pieces of bread hidden in their homes, just in case. The shock of too much food taught them something deeper than hunger ever had, that plenty could be as confusing as famine. As weeks turned into months, the Americans saw the prisoners grow stronger, heavier, and calmer. But under the surface, something more powerful was happening. The food was no longer just about survival. It was changing what these men believed about their enemies, their country, and even themselves. And that quiet change would become visible soon, when the guards began finding the hidden evidence buried right beneath the Kansas soil. By late summer 1943, the camp at Concordia had settled into a strange routine. The German prisoners were no longer frightened of the guards or the fences. They worked in the fields during the day, played soccer in the evenings, and lined up 3 times daily for meals that looked more like feasts than rations. Yet behind this calm, the habit of hiding food still lingered, buried, quite literally, beneath their feet. The first discovery came one warm August morning. A guard named Private Tom Reynolds was inspecting the area behind Barrack 12, when his boot sank slightly into the dirt. He bent down, brushed away the soil, and uncovered something soft and round, a roll of bread wrapped in paper. When the other guards dug deeper, they found a small pit covered with planks. Inside were dozens of food items, 87 bread rolls, 23 pieces of cooked steak, 14 apples, and even a half-eaten pie. At first, the Americans thought it might be a hiding place for weapons or escape tools. But when they opened more pits near other barracks, they found the same thing, food carefully wrapped and buried like treasure. It became clear that the prisoners were not planning escapes. They were trying to build secret food stores just in case the kindness suddenly stopped. The camp commandant, Colonel William Adams, called a meeting with the German senior officers. He asked them calmly, "Why are your men doing this? They have plenty." One of the German captains replied honestly, "In our country, plenty never lasts. We are only trying to be ready." Colonel Adams didn't punish them. Instead, he gave an unusual order: no one would be punished for hoarding food, but from now on, random inspections would happen every morning. He wanted them to see that the food supply would never disappear, no matter what the guards found. Soon, the inspections became almost routine. Guards lifted mattresses, checked lockers, and searched the grounds. Every day, they found small piles of spoiled bread, rotting fruit, or jars of sugar hidden in odd places. The camp kitchen kept records of it all, a strange list of buried proof that fear still ruled the prisoners' habits. But something else began to happen too. With each inspection, more men stopped hiding food. They began to trust that tomorrow's meal would really come. Confidence grew slowly, like a plant in dry soil finally touched by rain. In one diary, a prisoner named Ernst Müller wrote, "The Americans do not lie. Every morning the bread truck arrives. Every noon, the stew smells the same. It is like a clock." The evidence of abundance became impossible to ignore. Camp reports showed that by October, the number of hidden food caches had dropped by nearly 80%. The daily medical logs noted fewer stomach problems, and the guards reported fewer tensions among the men. But trust brought something unexpected: reflection. Some prisoners started writing letters home, describing their new understanding of the enemy. "They fight cleanly," one wrote. "They win with factories, not cruelty." Others admitted quietly that they felt ashamed for believing Nazi propaganda about America's decadent, starving democracy. The American officers collected many of these letters before they were sent, checking them for security reasons. Some were later archived, and they tell a powerful story of disbelief turning into respect. One line appeared again and again in different forms. "This is not what we were told. The enemy feeds us better than our own army." For the Americans, this was more than just good behavior. It was strategy. A fed, calm prisoner caused fewer problems and became easier to manage. But for the Germans, it was something deeper. Every meal, every inspection, every buried roll of bread reminded them that the world outside Nazi Germany worked differently. It rewarded discipline, not fear. By winter, the buried food caches had mostly disappeared. The men finally began eating without worry. The guards, once seen as enemies, became part of their strange new world of safety and order. Still, not everything changed. Some prisoners, especially those older or from bombed cities, kept small emergency boxes under their beds, a biscuit, a sugar cube, or a piece of fruit. They never ate them, but never threw them away either. It was a quiet promise to themselves, never again to trust hunger. As the Kansas wind turned cold, and the wheat fields outside turned golden, the story of the buried bread spread through the camp like a folk tale, proof that fear could be dug up, examined, and in time, left behind. But beyond those fences, the question of how America could feed even its enemies so well was about to take the story far beyond the camp, into the heart of America's breadbasket. The men at Camp Concordia finally began to believe the food would never stop. Every day, breakfast came on time: bacon, eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch was stew, bread, and vegetables. Dinner often had meat and dessert. To them, it felt impossible. In Germany, even soldiers at the front rarely saw such meals, but in Kansas, this was just normal. What the prisoners didn't know was that their meals were part of something much bigger, a quiet, powerful machine behind America's strength. That machine was its land. Kansas in 1943 was overflowing with food. That summer alone, the state produced 241 million bushels of wheat, the highest in its history. Miles and miles of golden fields stretched in every direction from the camp, trains loaded with wheat, left every day for mills and bakeries. It seemed the land itself refused to run out. And it wasn't just wheat. The number of beef cattle in Kansas reached 3.8 million, more than at any time before. Across the country, farms ran day and night. The U.S. government paid farmers to grow more, giving them fuel, tractors, and new machines. Even during war, the barns stayed full, and the fields stayed busy. At the Ellsworth Milling Company, the local supplier for Camp Concordia, workers ran 3 full shifts every day. They sent 60 pounds of flour for every 100 prisoners, every single day. That meant bread, rolls, pies, and pancakes for men who once thought bread was a weekly luxury. One American officer wrote in his diary, "We feed these men like our own boys, not because they deserve it, but because we can." That simple statement carried the truth. America could afford to be generous. Its farms, factories, and railways were untouched by bombs. While Europe burned, American soil kept producing. Every loaf of bread served to a prisoner was proof that abundance itself had become a weapon. Many prisoners began to notice. Some even asked their guards questions about the food. "How can you give us meat every day?" One man asked in broken English. The guard laughed and said, "This is Kansas. Their soul's always another cow." In their letters home, the Germans tried to describe what they saw. One wrote, "The fields here go on forever. They grow enough for themselves and for their enemies too." Another added, "Now I understand why we lost. They fight with food as much as with guns." The camp records supported this feeling. The U.S. Army's own regulation, No. 6331, issued in February 1943, required that every prisoner be fed like an American soldier, 3,000 calories per day, including fresh meat and vegetables. By comparison, the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad had received only 1,000 calories or less before it was destroyed. The difference was not just numbers, it was philosophy. America believed in feeding to win. A well-fed army could move faster, think better, and last longer. Germany's system focused on control, measuring every crumb, saving every drop, until the men were starving but still marching. Inside Camp Concordia, the prisoners began to feel this difference in their bodies. Within a few months, most had gained weight, an average of 8 kilograms each, according to camp medical reports. The Red Cross inspector, Dr. Friedrich Bowman, was amazed. He wrote, "The prisoners complain that the portions are too large. In 40 inspections across 3 continents, I have never heard such a complaint." To the Germans, this was almost comical. Men who once fought over bread crusts were now leaving half-eaten pie on their plates. The guards teased them kindly, saying, "What sep's wrong, Hans? Too much cake?" The prisoners would smile shyly and say, "Too much everything." But deep down, this abundance carried a lesson that went far beyond food. It showed that America's strength came not only from its weapons, but from its ability to give and keep giving, to grow more, feed more, and never run out. The prisoners began to see their enemy differently. They realized that power could come from kindness, not cruelty. They had been told that the Americans were weak, soft, spoiled by comfort. But now they saw the truth. It was comfort itself that made them strong. As the winter winds returned to Kansas, the wheat fields turned brown, waiting for spring. But the storerooms at Camp Concordia stayed full, and the kitchen fires never went out. The men no longer buried bread or hid butter. They began to laugh more, sing more, even share jokes with the guards. For the first time since the war began, many of them stopped feeling hungry, not just in their stomachs, but in their hearts. But in another part of America, new groups of prisoners were arriving, men from Italy, from France, and from North Africa. And for them, the shock of abundance would begin all over again. As the months passed, the prisoners at Camp Concordia began to change in ways no one expected. At first, they were proud German soldiers, stiff, silent, and distant. They followed orders, stood tall, and rarely spoke to the Americans. But now, after months of good food, fair treatment, and peaceful days, their hearts started to soften. It began with small things. A prisoner would wave at a guard instead of turning away. Another would help carry supplies to the kitchen. Some even smiled when the guards made jokes. The Americans noticed this change too. One officer wrote in his journal, "These men came here as enemies. Now they greet us like neighbors." Every day, life inside the camp looked a little more normal. The Germans were given work, building furniture, painting, fixing machines, and helping on nearby farms. The US Army paid them 80 cents a day, part in camp money and part in Red Cross coupons. They could spend it at the camp canteen to buy soap, tobacco, postcards, or sweets. This system did more than keep them busy. It gave them purpose. The men who once carried rifles now carried tools. They began to take pride in their work again. One German carpenter even built wooden toys for the American Guards' children. When he handed one to a sergeant, the man was surprised. "For my boy?" he asked. The prisoner smiled and said softly, "Yes, for peace." Outside the camp, the people of Concordia were also changing. At first, many locals feared the idea of enemy soldiers living nearby. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the fences. But soon they saw that these enemies were not monsters. They were just young men far from home. Farmers especially began to appreciate their help. During harvest season, hundreds of German prisoners were sent to local farms under guard. They worked hard, laughed, and even sang old songs while picking wheat and corn. Many American farmers later said they worked better than most hired hands. In one letter, a Kansas farmer, Sepp's wife, wrote, "I was nervous at first, but these boys are polite and kind. They thank me for every meal. Sometimes they remind me of my own sons." The rules said there could be no friendships, but kindness often found a way. Farmers sometimes gave the prisoners extra cookies or lemonade on hot days. And when Christmas came, something remarkable happened. The people of Concordia sent gifts to the camp. There were boxes of fruit, cakes, and cards that said things like, "Peace on earth, even for you." The prisoners were deeply moved. Many cried that night, reading messages from strangers in a foreign language that still managed to touch their hearts. One German sergeant told his men, "If our people treated prisoners like this, maybe the world would look different." The camp's American commander, Major Joseph B. Kilgore, believed the same thing. He said, "If we teach these men how decent people live, maybe they'll take it home with them." That became the quiet mission of Camp Concordia, not to punish, but to teach. Education classes were started. The Red Cross and YMCA brought books, maps, and even chalkboards. The prisoners could study English, geography, or history. Some learned how the US government worked, about democracy and freedom of speech. One of the teachers, Sergeant Robert Willis, said, "They asked me how our elections work. I told them, fate, we vote, even against our leaders, and no one is punished." Fate, they couldn't believe it. For many German prisoners, this was the first time they had seen freedom in action, not as a word, but as a way of life. The guards treated them fairly, the people treated them kindly, and no one forced them to believe anything. As spring came again, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a small town behind fences. The men played soccer in the afternoons and performed music in the evenings. They built a small stage and organized plays, some funny, some sad. Even the guards came to watch, clapping and laughing along. A prisoner named Otto wrote in his diary, "I came here thinking America was my enemy, but every day I see that freedom feeds people better than fear." By the end of 1944, Camp Concordia had one of the best records of any POW camp in the United States. There were no escapes, no violence, and almost no punishment reports. The Red Cross praised it as a model of humanity in wartime. But the war outside was still raging. In Europe, cities burned and soldiers died by the thousands. Inside the camp, radios reported news of battles at Normandy and the fall of Berlin. Many prisoners wept when they heard that their hometowns were destroyed. Still, they were safe in Kansas, fed, healthy, and treated with respect. And when the war finally ended in May 1945, many said goodbye to their guards with tears in their eyes. Some even shook hands through the barbed wire. Before leaving, one prisoner said to a guard, "When I go home, I will tell my children that kindness defeated us more than bullets did." It was a quiet truth, one that would live long after the war ended. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. The guns were silent, the tanks stopped moving, and cities across Germany lay in ruins. In Camp Concordia, the German prisoners listened to the news in stunned silence. Some cried quietly, others sat still, not knowing whether to feel relief or shame. Their homeland had fallen, and Adolf Hitler, the man many once called their leader, was gone. But for the men inside the Kansas camp, something even more confusing was happening. They didn't want to leave. For 2 years, they had lived in safety, with full meals, warm beds, and fair treatment. They had worked, studied, and even laughed again. Life had become simple and peaceful, but now, they were told they would soon be sent home to a land they no longer recognized. The US Army began preparing the transfer. Records show that by September 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were being sent from American camps back to Europe. Concordia alone prepared hundreds each week. Before departure, every man received a medical check, clean clothes, and a small package with soap, cigarettes, and a Red Cross letter. Some were eager to go home. "I want to see my family," said one prisoner named Carl, "even if everything is gone." But others were afraid. "We Serberherd there, Seb, there's nothing left. No food, no homes." Another said, "Here we eat 3 times a day. Over there people starve." And he wasn't wrong. Germany in 1945 was starving. Allied reports showed that many civilians were living on less than 1,200 calories a day, mostly bread and potatoes. There were no cows left in many regions. Whole cities like Hamburg and Dresden were piles of ashes. So when the first groups of Concordia prisoners were shipped out, something strange happened. Several begged to stay. A few even offered to keep working for free on local farms. "Let me earn my way," one pleaded to the camp commander. "I don't should want to go back to hunger." Of course, the rules didn't allow that. They were soldiers, and soldiers had to return home. On the day of departure, the mood was heavy. The prisoners packed their few belongings, books, hand-carved wooden toys, small gifts from the Americans. They lined up in rows, as guards checked names one last time. Then something unexpected happened. The American guards, who had once watched them with rifles, now came to shake their hands. One guard said, "You came here as enemies, but you leave as men we respect." Many prisoners broke down in tears. "Danke," they said. "Thank you." As the trucks rolled away, the people of Concordia came out to watch. Some waved handkerchiefs. Farmers stood by the road, their hats over their hearts. It was not a victory parade. It was a farewell between people who had shared something deeply human. When the ships carrying the Germans finally reached Europe, the shock was brutal. The air smelled of smoke and burned wood. Trains were broken, bridges gone. Families searched through ruins for food. The well-fed men from America suddenly became outsiders in their own land. "They called us the fat ones," one prisoner wrote. "They said we looked like Americans." Some former POWs even felt guilty for how well they had lived while their families starved. Doctors noted that many suffered from reverse shock. Their bodies, used to 3,000 calories a day in the US, could not adjust to Europe's shortages. Within weeks, many lost 15 to 20 pounds. One Red Cross doctor wrote, They were strong and healthy when they arrived. Now they grow weak again. Instus were ter strangefrus. Still, they carried something powerful home, not just weight, but wisdom. They had seen a country that treated its prisoners better than their own government treated its citizens. They had seen democracy, kindness, and abundance with their own eyes. Some tried to explain this to others. "America fought us with food," said one. "They won by showing what freedom can build." Others kept quiet, unsure if people would believe them. But deep down, many former prisoners knew they had changed forever. They could no longer see the world as they once had. In the years that followed, some of these men helped rebuild Germany. They became teachers, engineers, and businessmen. A few even returned to America years later, not as prisoners but as immigrants. One wrote to a farmer in Kansas, "You once gave me bread when I had nothing. I want to live in the land where that kind of man lives." It was proof that the lessons of Camp Concordia had traveled far beyond its barbed wire. As the last prisoners left the camp, Major Kilgore walked through the empty barracks. The beds were clean, the tables empty, the air still. He looked around and said quietly, "This was never just a prison, it was a classroom." Because in that classroom, thousands of men had learned that true strength isn't in hate or hunger, it's in fairness, dignity, and generosity. The Germans came to America as enemies, but they were leaving as students of humanity. And what they carried home would feed more than bodies. It would feed the future. When the war finally ended, and the German prisoners went home, Camp Concordia slowly became quiet. The fences stood empty. The kitchens that once served hundreds of meals a day were now silent. The American guards packed up and left. Only the Kansas wind moved through the wooden barracks, carrying memories of voices in two languages, English and German. But even though the camp was empty, its story was not over. What happened inside those fences continued to live on, in letters, diaries, and the lives of the men who had once been prisoners there. In the years after the war, many former German POWs wrote back to the people of Concordia. Some sent photos of their new families. Others mailed Christmas cards that said things like, "I have never forgotten your kindness." One man, named Heinrich, wrote to his old guard in 1947, "You treated us as humans when we did not deserve it. That changed me more than the war ever did." It was a simple message, but it captured the truth, that America had won something greater than victory on the battlefield. It had won respect, trust, and even friendship from its former enemies. Back in Germany, many of the returning prisoners shared stories that sounded almost unbelievable. They told their families how the Americans had fed them well, allowed them to work, and treated them with fairness. Some even told stories of being given books, soap, or warm clothes by local Americans. At first, people didn't believe them. "That can't be true," one woman said. "Why would your enemies treat you kindly?" But when more and more men told the same story, the truth began to spread. Historians later found that this experience helped shape how post-war Germany rebuilt itself. The men who had seen America's example came home with new ideas about freedom, fairness, and dignity. They had lived in a place where guards and prisoners could shake hands, where even in war, humanity was not forgotten. In the 1950s, some of those same men joined Germany's new army, the Bundeswehr, built under democratic values. Many officers later said that their time in American POW camps taught them how to lead with respect instead of fear. One said, "We learned discipline from Germany, but we learned decency from America." Camp Concordia itself became a quiet landmark. The buildings slowly fell apart, but people in Kansas still remembered the time when thousands of German soldiers lived just outside their town. Farmers told their children, "Those men helped harvest our wheat one summer." Others kept wooden toys or carvings made by the prisoners as family treasures. Years later, in the 1980s, historians visited the site. They found old coins, buttons, and bits of German writing scratched into the wood. One message, carved deep into a bunk frame, said simply, "Danke, America." The story of the camp also became part of a larger lesson about war. While much of the world remembered the battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, Iwo Jima, the story of how America treated its prisoners showed another side of victory. It showed that real power is not only in weapons, but in mercy. When people talked about World War II, they often said that America's greatest strength was its industry, its ships, planes, and tanks. But those who had lived in the camps knew something different. America's greatest weapon was its abundance, and its willingness to share it, even with those who had once been its enemies. By giving food instead of fear, the United States had shown the prisoners what freedom truly meant. Freedom was not chaos or cruelty. It was fairness, hard work, and opportunity. As one German officer wrote years later, "We learned that a nation is truly strong when it feeds both its friends and its enemies." The lesson of Camp Concordia was not written in textbooks. It was written in the memories of men who had come as conquerors and left as students. They carried that lesson home, into their families, their towns, and the future of their country. Even today, visitors still come to Concordia to see the small museum built near the old camp grounds. Inside, there are photos of smiling German soldiers working on Kansas farms, eating at long tables or playing soccer behind barbed wire. There are letters of thanks, diaries in faded ink, and old utensils used in the mess hall. Each artifact tells the same quiet story, that in a time of hate, kindness still had power. The men who once looked at those trays of food and asked, "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" had learned that abundance was not an insult, but an invitation to see that a free society could be strong because it cared for others, not in spite of it. And so the story ends where it began, with food on a table and disbelief in the air. Only this time, the disbelief is not about the size of the portions, but about the size of the hearts that offered them. In the end, America's greatest victory was not won with bombs or bullets, but with bread, fairness, and faith in humanity. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give an enemy is kindness.